Good morning. Here we are with another Charter Ed Talk. Thank you for joining us. This is a very special one. We're going to be talking to our CEO, Stuart Ellis, about kind of the history of charter school capital, so that folks who are curious might want to understand kind of the impetus behind where you were when you started it and the ideas that you had, and how did you come up with this thing, because it is a very unusual market for someone who's entrepreneurial to jump into.
Thanks, Janet. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, first off, I didn't come up with it. So I guess you should back up of why we started the company in the first place, and what we're really trying to do, and like most things in life, however you figure it's going to go, it never goes that way, actually. And usually it comes out better than you would have imagined, but always totally different than you would ever have planned. So I was, it's now 12 years ago or something like that. I was traveling very heavily for advisory work I was doing for most of the major banks in the US and Europe. We had a global practice and things we were doing for a lot of the banks in the world, and I was on the road more than 250 days a year, and thought it'd be really nice to see my family once in a while. And I thought I was looking for a way to create a role, job, business for myself that could support new lifestyle objectives as I approached 40, and do things that would also have a significant positive social impact. And I created a criteria for the business I wanted to either create or buy or something. And I started getting ideas from colleagues and close friends. And one of the ideas that came along, amongst a dozen that I was looking at, one of the ideas came along was regarding charter schools and their need for money, funding, capital, particularly for growth, which most charter schools, as I understood at the time, couldn't really get. I didn't even know what a charter school was, actually, at the time. So I didn't really understand what the issue was. And the idea that was presented by one of my co-founders was, hey, these charter schools are coming. They were coming to him to get donations, which he couldn't generate enough donations for them, but he was in that space. And they had a need. And the need was to get this financing for growth. They had a lot of waiting lists, and they couldn't fund any of that because of the way the state funding process worked in California initially. And he had thrown that out to me, and I didn't know what a charter school was, and we kind of looked into it. And in thinking about it originally, it was, and after talking to a few leaders in the space, there was this opportunity to serve students and families significantly better with education that was more customized to the individual child, meets them where they are as opposed to the other way around, where school districts that have funds and are government agencies are trying to do the best they can with teachers who are doing the best they can, but with a structure that is really constrained. And the charter schools had this opportunity to do things that were innovative in the context of how much money they got, fine, but they couldn't get the normal investment capital that any small organization, nonprofit or for-profit, needs to grow and expand. And so they had families and students that wanted to attend, but they couldn't get everybody in, and so they would grow by like 20 kids a year. They could add one teacher, but they might have 200 or 300 on a list. So we started looking into it, and actually initially I didn't really get like what the opportunity was. Like the idea proposed was, hey, we could charge less than the banks are charging. And I was looking back saying, how do we do that? Our capital will cost even more, because there'll be the charter school risk plus the risk of our company, like it'll cost us even more, and we'll never get money to the schools cheaper. So as we started looking into it, or I went on and was looking at other opportunities, and I kept coming back to it because I couldn't actually understand what or how a charter school was structured. And as I learned about it and realized it was all government money, state, local, federal money, I realized that the flow of funds to the schools was coming from a really low risk source, and that even though people in the industry or in the capital markets and the financial markets viewed charter schools as very high risk organizations because they were break-even institutions, nonprofit running, with little or no margin of any kind, run by educators and concerned parents, is like just not the kind of thing that institutions wanted to finance or lend money to.
Right.
But if we could find a way to allow investors, capital markets, financial institutions fund the state risk, the state payment obligations, which were really low risk, usually like AA credits or better, instead of taking charter school risk. If they could take that risk, money could flow into the charter school space really readily at very low cost relative to what the schools could get it at. And most schools couldn't even get it, it turned out. If we could find a way to do that, there was a way to have funds just flow into the individual schools, fund the waiting list, fund the growth, and let them really serve the mission so much better than they already were, which is to educate more kids with higher quality education and keep spreading that. So we got into it. Nobody had ever done anything like this, and as we went into it, we talked to probably a dozen different law firms that all said somewhere between it's impossible, that doesn't work, it's illegal, all of which it turns out were wrong. And then eventually we found a law firm, the biggest education bond council in California, organization called Orrick, Harrington, Sutcliffe, that created this, helped us create this tool. And they actually believed in it, and they believed in me and our team and what we created, or what the idea we had, and they started working on it. In fact, they did it really on their own nickel for a while as we built it together, and it took 2 years for us to actually come up with a solution that allowed funds to flow, and that ended up being this receivables purchase model which we developed, which, although an idea tried in many other industries, had never occurred here at all. And what they realized and we realized was that if we could do this, we could get all this money flowing into individual charter schools to allow them to serve more and more students and more kids and fund more and more teachers. And these institutions could really survive and thrive doing what they could do better than the other public school options were. And that really, it took 2 years to do before we funded our first school in December of 2007, but it unlocked this potential to have funds and financing flow. And I mentioned that I didn't either have the original idea or even come up completely with the solution. The motivation for it was that the 9th charter school founder in California, the guy who founded the 9th charter school in California, I think it was the 9th, Randy Gashler, who had, I think 9 schools by the time we were 7 to 9 schools by the time we were talking to him. He sat with us early and he said, Stuart, don't solve the problem for the 5% of charter schools that actually have access to capital, that are flexible, that are already big and scaled and all that. Don't solve it for them. Actually solve the problem for the other 95% that don't have money. And what our model did was it allowed us to separate counterparty risk for investors, to not be them looking at each individual charter school, which they would never fund, either because of the credit risk or because they were so small. It's like too much work. But to fund a pool where the core investors didn't really even care about the charter schools, because by virtue of our structure in this receivables purchase model, we were able to do things that had never been done with government receivables before, had never applied in the education space, models that had worked in other industries but couldn't apply here, that really required we had 7 different legal disciplines come together to develop it initially. And we were able to address Randy's issue, which is solve it for the other 95%. And as we did that, we had no idea that when we launched it that the credit markets were going to crash around the world. 2007, for those of you who've seen the movie The Big Short, really in late summer, early fall, like all the financial institutions of the country are on the rocks, and we had raised all our initial money, and then all the bank that we were funding with actually closed its doors, and it was a major bank, like Barclays Capital actually closed. Barclays closed the division that was funding us. We literally went from having $100 million to having nothing overnight, and having to start all over with like a $2 million angel investor, and then piece this together, and I think we got that money from like a guy I met on an airplane, a stranger who gave me a phone number that I cold called. Like it was really just this completely upside down, everything went wrong, and then here we were with this model around growth where we could acquire the state payment obligations and fund initially California charter schools right at a time when all the capital markets around the world are crashing and there's no credit flowing, and now everybody is funding nothing, and certainly they're not funding charter schools, which they weren't really funding before either, but now all the money pulled out, and we were the only ones sitting there, and we don't have any money either at the beginning, but by the end of 2008, less than a year later, we got a New York finance organization or a hedge fund to actually give us some money and some initial capital, and then it was 40 million, and then it grew, and literally in our first 2 years we were the only ones who were willing to fund charters, and we were attracting all this capital while deferrals began in California, and we end up funding some 200 charter schools. It was like 30 or 40%, including the 5% that Randy talked about, like Green Dot and other major institutions, charter institutions, leading organizations. They can't get money to even make normal payroll payments. Wow. And so our tool, which was created fundamentally to support growth, and is a tool that we've now rolled out across the country, that financing tool, which now costs 1/3 of what we were being charged when we started, because nobody believed in anything we were doing. That ended up, according to Caprice Young, who was the then CEO of the California Charter School Association and others in the industry, it ended up that the tool, we funded over $100 million by our third year in 2010, supporting, I think that year we funded 130 schools, primarily in California, who literally would have closed their doors when the state started deferring money to public schools. And so it really launched what we were doing and introduced us to the industry in a very different way, completely backwards from what we anticipated. But the tool we developed for something else ended up solving this other problem also, right? And while mostly what we've done is fund growth organizations, in 2009, after we had launched in California, the state of Minnesota, where charter law was originally created more than 25 years ago now, the state of Minnesota has this, they start expanding what they call the holdback, which is another deferral form as a result of recession, and or what I refer to as the great euphemism, which is because recession has all the numbers that are as bad or worse than the Great Depression, but we get to call it the Great Recession as though it wasn't that bad. They start delaying payments to public schools also, which is going to kill charter schools in Minnesota. We launched we were called by somebody, a leader in the charter school movement in Minnesota, in September of 2009. Late that fall, we get introduced to John Cairns, who is actually the attorney who wrote the original charter law in Minnesota and had relationships with all the schools there. And we go to some meeting, I think it was late September, we went to some meeting where 80% of the charter schools, over 100 charter schools in the state of Minnesota, are all in a room, like, to meet with us, and we're like, hi, and they don't know what we are, and there are people there from all sides of like the movement who don't trust us or believe anything we're saying, and nobody will fund them, and they don't know what's really coming, and the holdback increases that year. And people had called us because one of the leaders in that space in Minnesota, a woman named Lisa Irwin, who was really aggressive about trying to get us to come to the state, and we funded some of her schools. And Lisa is like, I think what you're doing in California, I've heard about, and I think it'll solve the problem in Minnesota. And she had projected that 30% of the charter schools in Minnesota would close by the spring of the first year, that they would run out of money. And nobody believed that. This is a little bit like Noah saying, it's gonna rain, everybody, and I'm building this big boat. You guys should all get ready for the rain, and people are like, whatever, dude. Lisa is like, we're all running out of money and we're gonna close. She says, if you guys don't get here, or I don't see anybody else who could solve it. We're this tiny little company, like in Portland, Oregon. And we're just looking to do it in the second state. She introduces us to John Cairns, and we start into trying to figure out how to, every state is different, so we have to figure out what are the laws in Minnesota, how does the laws work, can we apply our model, and we fund our first school in December of 2009. And by less than 1 year later, by December of 2010, less than 1 year after we launched, we were funding 22% of the charter schools in the state of Minnesota.
Wow.
And we funded most of those schools throughout the entire deferral period. It's a very mature market, so not a lot of charter schools are growing rapidly, so they don't need a lot of growth capital, but they all needed this because I think in year one, the holdback moved from like 10% of your money was delayed till the following summer, to 17%, then 27%, and then by year three, I think that state of Minnesota actually was deferring 40% of a school's in-month money to like the summer. So you would, like your October payment, it was going to be $100,000 a month. By the third year in, the state was like providing only $60,000, and then the other $40,000 they say we'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a teaching hamburger today, but they actually delayed it until August, September, and October. So you get a third of the money or something like that, in the 3 months, like a full year later.
Wow.
And so nobody could live like that, let alone nonprofit organizations running at break even, so we were able to take with our model and move all that money back. And when we fund growth too, whatever your student count is, we move forward, so you get it when you're paying the expenses. And so you're just kind of moving the funds around. And unlike a loan, by virtue of the fact that we're acquiring the state payment obligations, what's going on is the school, in addition to getting a very low discount rate, on an asset sale instead of a loan, without going into the details of the structure, which are mind-boggling, boring, fundamentally, it's like selling a desk. You're just selling the payment instead. And so if the payment actually comes late, and there were a lot of movement, there's no extra cost to the school. Like charter school capital is essentially eating all that timing delay, or the risk that payment doesn't even get made, or if a state said, I'm not paying schools or anything, which they did, in Chicago recently, and actually in California there were issues, and during the recession a lot of that was going on. The schools eliminated all that risk. They have the cash, and we wait for the payment. And so it solved problems in Minnesota and California for deferrals. But eventually things normalized when we got back to growth. And today we've funded, for this little idea that Randy Gashley, served the other 95%. We ended up funding some of the biggest organizations when they run into short-term crisis, or other organizations that have innovative models and can't get the funds for it can really grow like a weed. And now we've funded over 600 charter schools across the country. We're in 12 states today and expanding. We have a national footprint for a real estate or facilities financing, long-term facilities financing that we now do, that we started a little over 3 years ago, where we've invested over $350 million in that. We've invested more than $1.6 billion now in the over 600 charter schools we've funded, and we've served more than 800,000 kids, which is nothing really like what we anticipated. And it was the attorneys, who just kind of believed in the possibility and were willing to work 2 years for this. We didn't have any money, we didn't have anything to get it going. It was my co-founder had heard of the original need, going, there's got to be some way we can solve this problem. It was my other co-founder, Brad Coburn, who is probably the most sophisticated structured finance guy in the country. He would be embarrassed to hear me say that, which is probably why I say it. But he, we used the same securitization engine to access the capital markets for charter schools that he utilized at the height of the mortgage market, which allows investors to fund, mortgages without needing actually to know the underlying in each individual mortgage or underwrite to each thing. It's about a diversified pool which we provide to investors, and as a result, really what we've done is taken charter school risk, and kind of packaged them up in a little light blue box with the white ribbon, and just, it's the same thing, but by presenting it as a group and a pool and all these things, what the schools don't have to worry about. You just come to Charter School Capital and we're like, yes, here's your money, because we have hundreds of millions of committed capital, or like funds always available, always liquid, that we have reserved for schools. We can take that, and it's sitting and waiting for you whenever you need it or want it, and we go to the capital markets or the banks that are funding us and just draw down on a line of credit that's sitting reserved for the schools, that isn't being paid for by the schools unless and until you tap it like a line of credit. But once you've sold the payment, the receivable to us, you don't have any more risk about that. You just have the dollars, and the discount on that is so small relative to the value the schools create for each child they serve, or each student, or even the margin or additional benefits of scale that the schools get, or solving some near-term crisis where, hey, in order for me to stay afloat, I would have to, as a school leader, I'd have to lay off, imagine Minnesota, hey, we'll just lay off 40% of our teachers and limp through the year so we can survive. Well, you're going to have 50 kids, per 50 students per teacher. That doesn't work. So, whether it's a short-term crisis like that they have to deal with, bridging something, or the growth where you then get scale benefits, it far outstrips the cost of any of the financing we're doing. And as more and more schools come on board, as it gets bigger and bigger, our cost of capital that we pass through to the schools keeps dropping, and it keeps coming down. So we're now 2/3 lower cost than we were when we started 10 years ago. We're across, I mentioned the 12 states. We have the real estate financing, which solves a completely different problem, again, in a totally different way. And the original documents that we created, the Receivables Purchase Agreement, have been we understand from attorneys that we're the only company of our kind who's actually gotten federal copyright protection for our form of legal agreement, which allows all these funds to flow to charter schools, as a literary work of art. So if you go to the Federal Copyright Office, for U.S. Copyright Office, you can see J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter, literary work of art, and right next to it, Charter School Capital's Receivables Purchase Agreement. They're both really stimulating reads, and I'm not sure which really has created more value. One has certainly created a lot of joy, and the other has generated not nearly as much money as J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter, but both have their purpose and sit there, and we've been able to, I think a lot of what we've done, we're doing for the first time. We get most of our ideas from the client schools we serve. They have utilized our funds to really accomplish some amazing things. The pictures around our office is the video that we do are now 60-person staff today. The $1.6 billion has now gone out into charter schools, and we have 0 investor losses in our history, which I think really is just amazing in if you think about it. We've had some issues that have come up with schools over time where there have been collections issues, or Charter School Capital has had to take, any loss that has materialized, but it's so small that it has never affected any of the banks or financial institutions that have funded us. It doesn't even come close to that. And as a result, we've been able to prove that charter schools are really safe good risks for investors, which is why the cost of capital has dropped so much, and that we've been able to attract funds that the schools can use however they want it to support whatever their mission is, to grow and expand and provide the kind of quality education, higher quality education, more customized than the other public options that are available. And whether it's better than a private school option, is questionable. Some charter schools provide even better education than the very best and most expensive private schools. Innovatively utilizing the funds provided by the taxpayers to serve the public and each individual student and family. And by providing just this choice, where you can switch from, hey, if the school district serves you great, keep going there. If you want something or need something different and a local charter school serves you better, you now have the option of doing that. And the charter schools themselves can take on those extra students and provide the extra technology or invest in the programming, because the funds are now always available reliably, because it's not about what the individual charter school looks like. You just come in and say, hey, here I am. And so long as we check all the boxes that fit with what investors required, we're funding, whether it's the top 5%, sure, have access, but also the other 95% of schools that most organizations wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. You're all welcome here. And people are waiting, ready and excited to fund your stability and or growth in the future.
Stuart, thank you so much for telling the story. It's just fascinating, and we're so happy to be here with you today, 10 years later. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
12 years later.
12 years later.
Thank you even more.
Thank you.